This is Robert Clotworthy, and you are listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Here are your hosts, James McQuiston, Oak Island theorist and author, along with John Hamels, PhD and historical researcher. Get the whole story right here, brought to you by Rabbit Hole Investigations.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Oak Island Plus, episode 25, and the beginning of season 3, Jim.
Yep, we're rolling along nice.
Today, we got a really exciting show.
Yep, it's the first time we've ever had a in-studio guest.
Yeah, so
He'll be sitting next to us here in a few minutes. We just wanted to intro with the latest statistics. We're probably going to quit giving them someday because they're getting so high you can hardly say the number.
Right. Well, you know, we are always humbled by the fact that y'all are watching us and viewing us and giving us great feedback, and that's what we appreciate. So, Jim, as of this morning, we were breaking 104,000 views, which is just outstanding, and we're 22, almost 2,300 subscribers. Please, if you do watch and you haven't subscribed, it doesn't cost anything, and you just hit a button and you're part of our team here. So,
and you know, the TV season's almost over, and if by the time you watch this, it might be over.
Right.
But we continue on. Our goal is different. We like to talk about Oak Island. We like to delve into the nitty-gritty, and we're once a month, mid-month. That's my new thing to say. And we're going to keep trying to do this. Beginning of our third year, maybe it'll be the beginning of our 12th year someday.
Oh my God.
But anyway, there's always stuff to find. It's crazy.
Well, you know, and we do. I mentioned we welcome your feedback. And after today's show, we want to first of all note that we are going to be discussing a topic with due respect. It's potentially a sensitive matter, and that we want to fill in the backstory of not only Oak Island, but Nova Scotia before the Europeans were colonizing that area, and then forward into what we call our time frame, which is basically 1600s into like the late 1600s, right? So we'll be referencing the work of Dr. Nicole Gilhous, who did a lot of doctoral research on this. And you want to give the title of our show for today?
The Ghost People of Oak Island.
And Nicole did a lot of work on what she referred to as colonial ghosts. And we're going to be referencing her work throughout the show, so I may not always be mentioning her name, but a lot of what we're going to be talking about goes to her work and her credit that we discovered in the last year or so.
And our special guest is Leon Sam Briggs, and he's a direct descendant of Corn Planter, the Seneca chief. He's also a spiritual advisor to a indigenous group called the Métis. We're going to get him to pronounce that correctly for us, which is somewhat controversial at times. In the old days, it was spelt with a lowercase, and it basically meant mixed blood.
Right.
It eventually developed into an indigenous group that's on par in Canada with the First Nations and with the Inuit, which would be the Eskimo. Mm-hmm. So he's going to give us a lot of background on that. We're going to delve into what Nicole did, and we're going to go to Oak Island.
All right. So, as always, we are taking away the mystery, and we're giving you the history.
Yep.
How's that for my phrase?
Okay, we got the phrases anyway.
Okay, we'll be right back, and stay tuned. We're going to have Leon here shortly. And as promised, we are ready to roll with our special guest. And Jim, I'm going to let you introduce him.
Mr. Leon Sam Briggs.
Welcome to Oak Island Plus.
You always get a wiggle.
Now, you want to start right out by telling them who the heck you are?
My name is Leon Sam Briggs. I'm Hawk Clan, Tonawanda, Seneca. My Seneca name is Hoyt de Gilhous, and I'm a historical reproduction specialist. So what I do is I get the benefit of traveling around the world in different places on everybody else's money, making pieces, and I've been able to see some of the things here in some of the dig sites and pieces that were coming out of the ground. The oldest diaderm made, is right here from North America. It's not around the world. It's right in the Blue Licks.
And you've been up to Nova Scotia, right?
Yes.
In Quebec, as far as Quebec?
Yep, I have tribal land in northern Quebec up the tip of James Bay, so a lot of times I would spend my winters and stuff up there and be able to travel and trap. And
Wow. So what's your connection to Oak Island in Nova Scotia? Can you explain that for us? Because that's really what we want to focus on today.
Right, well, a lot of it is my producer that I work with on another series of stuff we are doing, Tyler A. Chase, and she is Mi'kmaq and French Canadian, and so we get to talking back and forth, and we've been working on a documentary series on of a lot of these historical sites, these different places. When I was up in Maine and Vermont and those areas up there, we got a chance to travel north for a month and go to visit, and we had happened to stop, and this is probably some of the first boat tours and stuff they did around the island. We couldn't get in, they'd schedule stuff wrong part of the week, so we ended up getting a boat tour, but visiting some of the other historical sites and stuff up there, as a historical reproduction specialist, looking at pottery, looking at pieces. This is original crooked knife. And people look at these. This is about 250 years old.
Wow.
So this was given to me. I took it apart, cleaned it up, and I still use it. So when we're building birch bark canoes and doing things like that. But people don't realize that they look at that, well, why is the blade bent? Well, when Lewis and Clark were going through, they found, well, if we had one knife, we break it in half, we have two knives. So that's where that bend actually came from. And so using these, and then it's used completely different than you would, a regular knife. So being able to see some of the pottery and some of the pieces that have been there historically, even some of the burial vessels and stuff that they had for some of the artifacts that they sent with them.
Now, the Mi'kmaq are in the Mahome Bay, the Oak Island area,
Right.
and all across Nova Scotia. So how far back do they go?
They go back easily into the 1400s.
Okay.
You see a lot of division in different areas there because of Christianity. And you see a lot of the, I remember Tyler saying, growing up, and, her mother and grandmother didn't talk a whole lot about, what they did and why they did it because, we got to go to church. But she had other relatives and stuff that they talked about, and then other people that she's interviewed and then she's talked with. And I got to spend time with Buffy St. Marie, and over the years at different places, and a lot of times all the way back to when we were doing the filming, the time of the Last of the Mohicans. And listening to people that were coming down from Canada and saying, wow, it's nice to be here in your territory and stuff where it's more organized. And so you see a lot of that in those fractured communities. And like we were talking earlier and stuff, a lot of times the churches would come in, they would build their church on top of a cemetery or burial grounds. Wow. They could control the native population because that's where their ancestors are.
Well, you mentioned that your producer was basically half Mi'kmaq, half European,
right.
And that's kind of what we're talking about, referring to here today of the ghost people. It's people whose history was not, in traditional sense, recorded, like strictly Mi'kmaq or strictly French or strictly Scot. They kind of blended into the forest and they did their own thing, and a lot of that got lost, and it only exists in like people's diaries. There's a 1 or 2 lines in a diary. There's something in a deed. There's something in a marriage or death contract or whatever, and you got to pick all those pieces out to build the story.
In a lot of it, one of the things that you see with a lot of the artwork, especially when you get into some of the pottery that hits into the 1600s, you start seeing a lot of European, especially Irish and Scottish.
There you go.
Designs in those. I sent you the pictures of those pots that I made last night,
Mm-hmm.
and doing them and firing in the ground. Where you was seeing some of this pottery and stuff, how it was made in different places. But it was like our histories, even like with these wampum belts.
Wow.
These are written histories. And we talk about where we go and where we come from, and in that. When you see pieces that people carry and you see the stories that are in them, the way they were made, a lot of the times it tells their lineage. So when you see a lot of those pieces, even in the quill work, so when you look at the quill work and you look at the designs, you start seeing floral designs, you start seeing Celtic designs. We kind of laugh because people think that the swastika is the white fascist or Nazi, and it's part of the whirling rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
In the way that it traveled. So when we have our pieces, even in our beadwork and our finger weaving,
Why don't you bring that over here and let me get a closer look.
And it has, just the strap. There's almost 100 hours. And that's one strand at a time in each bead put on.
Wow.
Then the quill work, but even reproduction work of making art, and I use them when I'm hunting and stuff. I use bone and stone knives, and I've done demonstrations at different places and showing them and how they work. And people are like, "Well, it gets dull." I says, "Well, you just pick up an antler and and it's right back to sharp."
Wow.
And I know I told you before about being on Oak Island right after they found the Mi'kmaq dig site, and they found a lot more than that bowl. They found arrowheads and a hide scraper and whatever, but it was upsetting to them because it was new. They had never really went down that path of the native people and that history on Oak Island. Of course, it shut down that one particular dig, but that's why we're thinking that has to be explored. This is a part of Oak Island history that it's been ignored until the show, basically.
Right.
And we're trying to bring it to the
And when you
forefront.
look at, Columbus, he got here. Well, the Dutch were here in our records 69 years before Columbus, and the Vikings were here 150 years before that. Now you start seeing these places that they're finding, like just in Michigan, they found the dugout canoes,
Mm-hmm.
and they're starting I keep laughing every time those fence posts come up or those markers and stuff, and people say, "Oh, these were cut with an axe." Well, when you look at the grain and just looking at them, I says, "No, that wasn't cut with an axe. That was cut with a draw knife." Because an axe would keep a shearing going
that's
down.
true, yeah.
So when you're looking at them and they're showing them, somebody sat there and cut those because the grain's being cut down. It's not being sheared. And so there's a difference between looking at something that's been sawed, something that's been used, with a draw knife, but also something that's been axed.
You told us through Jim. You told Jim, and he told me that those posts that they're a couple feet to whatever, they were used for a particular reason by the Mi'kmaq.
Right.
For what?
And we've used, they're all over the world. I mean, I've seen Viking ships with them stuck in the ground, holding the frame together. Well, when I've done demonstrations of building dugout canoes, and we pound one end, and we cross them, we put our log in. Well, you got 3 people working on, say, a 1,000-pound log. You can't pick it up,
Secure it,
but it's real easy to move when it's in there. And especially once you get the bark off of it, because then you can work it down. Then you can tip it. You can do, doing all of your cutting and your grinding with stones and then putting your fire and stuff in. But you see a lot of those pieces in the way they were done. One of the things that we've seen in Nova Scotia, one of the dugouts that was broke, that was probably back in 84, 85. And they said, well, look at these stains in there. And I just kind of laughed. And I said, they were trying to figure out what. And I said, we take Washington hawthorns and we put them in pokeberry juice and we just let them soak. So once you get down through and you start cutting and you want to get your thickness down, you turn that over and you hammer those thorns down through.
Oh my gosh.
And so you start cutting, and when you start seeing that purple, you know that you're at 1.5 to 2 inches.
Wow.
So that's giving your signature of the depth. And like you put a log in the water, and it's only going to float one direction. So you can spin it and spin it, spin it, but every time it's going to have a buoyant line coming up one way.
And what this points out is what we've been preaching right along, and I started preaching it way back in my first books in 2017, is the pragmatic nature of so much that it's become a mystery just because the story behind it got lost. But people had to function. They didn't come with everything when they landed. They had to grow crops. They had to
Build
talk
houses
to the indigenous people about
find
helping
water.
them out, whatever. And so you look back at if you look at it from a pragmatic point of view, it's like, oh yeah, that was life back then. This is what they were doing.
And going right along with that, as soon as you told Jim about those posts, then we started thinking about what we've been talking about, as you said, Jim, everyday things that are being put on TV. And I'm not going to pick on any particular show, but anybody that talks about artifacts, they create this kind of mystery about it. And we're just sitting going like, well, that's not what you think it is. It's just everyday life. It's a surveyor's mark. It's something that was used, as you said, for a canoe. Or when they find circular stones, that was probably a fish weir. Right? So can you talk about those a little bit?
Yep, but when you look at those, it's like you were talking about that little round piece with the hole and stuff, and it was funny because you talk to Scottish people, and some women are like, we so dim in the bottoms of all our dresses, we weren't going to do the Marilyn Monroe, so keeping their dress down. Yeah. But you look at those pieces and how things were developed, and then you see people coming from other countries, and a lot of times, like when the French were moving, they just carried metal. They carried their blades, and so then they knew there was wood, they could make their tools. Mm-hmm. So when they're going through, so when you would see the French guys traveling, they didn't have all their axes. Everything was what they call pole style, which was tapered to go in. So you can look at artifacts like that and see that it was tapered. Well, you knew that was French, or if it was squared off, draw it in, it was, British or English because of the way the handles went in.
Beautiful.
So I'm going to just put this slide on the screen for a minute. And of course, it has your picture on it. But you told me you were a Seneca Elder and a Matisse
Right.
spiritual leader.
Right.
Now, is that for the organization that's referred to as like the larger organization with a capital M? Yes,
and I'm ordained through the United Woodland Matisse in the United States and Canada, so I can do weddings, I can do funerals, and I don't have a border. And then being Haudenosaunee, we don't, because the Constitution, treaties is supreme right of the land, so we travel around the world on indigenous passports. But we have to have a U.S. passport to come back in this country, so we just go to Canada and then travel down through there. But as Métis, you see a lot of the differences in them that, like especially with the French, the Irish, the Scottish, a lot of those people, Johnson, he took on Molly Brant for a wife, which was Joseph Brant's sister. And you see all the way down through history that you see people from European descent, but it was more that the French, the Scottish, or the Irish and stuff, they were more apt to wanting to learn and live with the people, saying, well, you know, they've survived here, they've done all of this. And then the English, they were like, well, we're gonna stand fast, and it's gonna be our way. Well, then, you know, you look at the Dare Stone and all of that stuff. Well, yeah, it was your way, but now what's it?
And I think up in Nova Scotia particularly, because it was war-torn for
Right.
an awful lot of its history, that if you have a small group and you're being attacked by a bigger group, the safest place to go is into the forest with your indigenous wife and kids and just disappear until things settle down. And for up to a large part, they just never did settle down. Really, as close as it got was Cornwallis in 1749 when he established Halifax. But even after that, you know, there was the expulsion of the Acadians, and even today. And I think that's why they don't. Number one, they have a very strict archaeology rules, very strict up there, more strict than just about anywhere. I think part of that's because you're going to be imposing on somebody else's culture almost no matter where you go. It could be you're imposing on a French fort or a Mi'kmaq settlement. But the other thing is they just had their 400th anniversary. What was it, 2000? Well, they were formed in 1621. So in 2021 would have been 400 years. I spoke with the government and I spoke with the Historical Society, and they did nothing to celebrate. Now, if you know, we're going to hit our 250th next year, as far as the United States goes, and you better believe there's going to be a celebration. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity up there, and there obviously was on Oak Island because A, it shut them down in a heartbeat, and B, they were all so upset. I thought somebody died or something. I got on the island, everybody's got their head down, you know. And
When you look into archaeology, one of the things that I've seen a lot, in being able to deal with a lot of the archaeologists, and I find that, you know, by the work that I do is that I've been able to get original pieces back, and we've done filming work of returning them, and you know, to places out west or Alaska and different places. But with that is, you know, you have contract archaeologists. You know, you have government archaeologists, you have state archaeologists, you got amateurs. So one of the things that I've seen in Canada, there's always been a lot more documentation. Down here in the States, you know, you'll see guys write up, you know, they have big finds or something, then they'll write it up. Up there, they tend to write up every dig site they do, even if they're just going in, you know, for a building site.
well, I'm going to put this other slide on the screen here, and it speaks a lot about you. And so, if you just want to cover some of your background and your skills level and all that, I just want people to get to know you.
We were down to Pittsburgh when they did I was with Warren Sky, and so when we were down there and they were doing the statue, and one of the things that Warren Sky says, you know, when you build, because Washington, or Nonageas as we call him, he was, you know, tall, and then, you know, you look at Sequoia, you look at Tecumseh, you see people that, you know, you would think that they were, and so, you know, Guyasuta was another one. You know, Guyasuta was them. You know, they led them to Fort LeBeuf, you know, for them to tell the French to get, you know, to leave. And so I am 7th generation descendant from Guyasuta and 6th from Corn Planter. So on Tonawanda, the house that I grew up in was the house where Handsome Lake lived. Corn Planter, other people have lived there at different times. And Handsome Blake's mother and grandmother are actually buried in the front yard.
Wow.
So seeing a lot of these places and things that we do, going in and discussing who we are, where we come from, a lot of other at times in other nations and stuff. The same thing as having in Nova Scotia right now is you're having a fight between, basically the same people, but one side is Christianized and one side is what we would call longhouse or traditional. And so when people talk about the Micmac, and those are the Christianized people, and it kind of means whirling. And the Mi'kmaq, they are the traditional. Well, the Mi'kmaq says, well, no, they're just crazy. And so when you look at Christianity and you look at those, and you go back to, like Obale, you have mixed blood there,
Which is corn planter.
Mm-hmm. And so his part of the family, you look at John Baptiste. You look at these people, how they've come to be, and the statesmanship. One of the things with Gaius Suda and Corn Planter and Brant, they were all literate. They could read, they could write. So, and that's where a lot of these issues and stuff came up, especially like with George Washington or Hononegaius. We always use that word Hononegaius. People say, "Oh, it's town destroyer." Says no, it means he bites on the town. And that all comes from Sullivan's campaign.
Well, you got quite a list of skills. I guess you'd have to call them skills or experience or whatever.
Yep. Within doing traditional art and stuff, and a lot of the reproduction work, places where I've traveled and getting to see some of the different archaeology, and a lot of times being able to go into some of these museums and these places, and they let you go into the back rooms. They let you go into the basements and to look at things. A lot of times you're not allowed to take pictures. You draw them or just keep it in your brain and stuff. But like it was just like I worked with a gentleman named Bill Brady and then George Abercrombie that were master blacksmiths. And so I've been a blacksmith for 52 years now. Whoa. And I've got pieces all over the world. And I've done a lot of reproduction work. Going from different things, even from native, traditions and stuff, into blacksmithing, into woodworking, into building. I'm just getting ready to go out to Minnesota. We're going to build another traditional earth house. And I know up in Nova Scotia, they've seen them up there, and people are like, how did they figure this out?
Could you describe that? What that house looks like?
Well, basically, it's like places like even over in the Newgrange, you see where they put the post in the ground, and then once they put them in the ground and they start building, and then they slide other posts in, and then they just cover it with earth.
Yeah, I've been in Newgrange.
And so it's like when you look at these things, but to be inside, and I can send you like videos and stuff, but it's like, minus 20 outside, and you're standing there like this inside, and there's no fire going. Because the earth
is 55 degrees.
55 degrees.
So I understand you were a rodeo, worked in a rodeo for 23 years. That's crazy.
Yep, and I got
aches and pains to prove it. Huh?
Well, one of the things when I started, I was 15, but I found out real fast that if you weren't really good, you weren't going to make any money. And one time we were at a rodeo in Kalispell, and one of the guys says, "Hey, well, man, our one clown got drunk and he's in jail. The other guy got hurt and stuff." And then they says, so I just filled in. And so we went in, put our stuff on, and put our makeup and stuff, and went out. But it was natural. Even as a lacrosse goalie, you've got people throwing a ball at you 130 miles an hour, and and you watch it. And I've had them hit me right break my chin pieces, break my, but I've had 6 fractured, broken jaws. But doing the rodeo and stuff, I found even raising cattle and being there that you stayed in close to them. They'll push you around, but they couldn't hurt you.
Yeah.
And that's what I found. And one guy John Gilstrap was always like, he says, "Briggsy," he says, "always keep your hand right where you can touch his nose or his horn."
Well, there you go.
And that's in I've been in. And
So Jim, tomorrow you can try this out.
I will. I'll let you know if I will.
being in places there, and then I've got jackets, and vests from international finals, rodeo and stuff with my name and stuff on it, and so when we go places and stuff, every once in a while I'll put them on it, and people out there.
Very cool. Very cool.
Now you mentioned lacrosse. That's like traditional lacrosse. It's not like
we're
high school lacrosse.
Yeah, we play box lacrosse, and box lacrosse has been, we called it the creators game, and I've done a number of programs and stuff, documentaries and stuff where we spoke on it, but it follows our creation story and the twins and stuff, and how our sticks are made, why they're made, and like I said, in the first games, they played on mile-long fields, and it was the birds against the animals, or the clans, and so then it was used for to settle disputes, but it was also used for healing, in playing for the people, even in midwinters. During our midwinter ceremonies, somebody may call for a lacrosse game for somebody for healing.
Wow.
Well,
I want to jump in for a sec. Leon, you've been saying a word that's music to our ears, Scottish. Okay? And Jim's done a lot of the legwork about the Knights Baronet coming to Nova Scotia.
Right.
And you said Scottish, and we never hear them talk about the Scottish or the Knights Baronet unless Jim is on that show.
yeah.
So, do you have any background with the Knights Baronet or the Scottish back in the 1620s, in that era?
I have seen. I see a lot of artifacts. I've seen a lot of most of the higher end blacksmithing and forging and foundry work and stuff you see was all done by the Scots.
Well, that reminds me of when Carmen was on our show. He pointed out a ox shoe. He said that's a Scottish built ox shoe. I can tell the difference, and he dated to around 1610.
Right. And that's one of the things where when I've shod oxen, I've built the shoes. And I know exactly what he's saying, because the Scotch, when they come from the Highlands,
Right.
they always rim weight their shoes because they want it thicker to the outside, because that foot is spreading as it's going down. Well, they're in the Highlands, they're walking, they don't have big, deep, piles of earth like we have. Sometimes they may get down 4 or 5 inches and it's solid rock. Mm-hmm. So that's why those shoes and stuff were made like that.
I always wondered how he knew that thing was. Yeah.
But when you
Scottish.
look at, now this pattern on here, this is, I do a lot of this on all of my knives. It's kind of my signature pattern. But Bill Brady, who's Scots, and George Abercrombie, when we worked on the flagship Niagara, we were doing work on there, and I'd never stamped my pieces. And George said, "Oh, you got to get your name." I says, "No." I said, "The Creator tells us they give us the gifts," and so people look at this pattern.
That's you.
And they know that, and guys are sitting there watching me do that, but the Scots were so smart that when they were fighting, these knights would go out and they would run somebody through with a sword, come back 3 months later, and they're fighting the same guys. And so they'd come to the blacksmith, and the Scots, they got smart about this, and they weren't allowed to sign any of their pieces. So what they did is they came up with a blood-letting pattern. Well, if you do this, it'll tear going in and tear going out, and you won't be fighting the same guys. But that's how the Scots actually use their knowledge and stuff for their style. And so when you look at those, it becomes a touch mark. It becomes a signature.
So, 1621, William Alexander gets permission to own Nova Scotia. And then he sends colonists through his son, William Alexander Jr.
Yeah, well, the first ship gets here in 1623, and
Right.
I think the history is far beyond what is normally talked about. There's just too many clues that extended, like he surveyed the whole country, and it had to be in 1623 because of different factors.
But then in comes the Rosilli and company, the Knights of Malta, and say, there's been a change and you guys got to leave. well, we know what 50 Scots was it stayed
Stayed
behind,
behind, and then they got chased down,
and so
all but 6, I think, went back. The other ones were married into
so would they be Métis?
indigenous.
Yes. Yep, they would be considered métis. Now, when you have intermarrying like that, they become part of their wife's clan.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your children, because we're a matriarchal society, and it wasn't until, like a lot of times after the European contact, that you've seen the patrilineal, that you've seen it going the other direction.
So this supports what Nicole was saying all along, was that she talks a lot about the French going into the wood, but the Scots would have been just prior to that, right?
Right.
Okay.
And I have a slide here that I'll just read a little bit on it just to clarify it for people, but I just auto-generated that photo you see there out of AI. I'm getting to be a fan of AI, but the Métis are, generally speaking, are a mixed race of indigenous people whose homeland basically included Canada and then the northern region of the United States. And they claim a culture derived from mixed indigenous and European ancestry, which is primarily French and Scottish with a little bit of English. Originally, Métis was a lowercase letter that just meant mixed blood, but now it's become an entire genre of indigenous people, and in fact, Canada recognizes them as one of 3, which are the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit, which would be, people would understand them with the word Eskimo. And but that designation between Métis and Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia has been a hot button item a little bit, which is why Professor Nicole came up with this idea of ghost people rather than get in the middle of the fray. She's trying to explain that there are people, they could be mostly French, mostly indigenous, mostly Scot, whatever, but they just disappeared because of wars, because of they just liked that lifestyle, whatever. And so she coined or recoined an old expression of ghost people, and they could be mixed marriage of French, possibly Métis, certainly the Mi'kmaq, because a lot of their history is not spoken about, and Scots. And so we called this episode Ghosts of Oak Island, but truthfully, these people were all over Nova Scotia during the 1600s, and mostly at, well, almost entirely at the locations that William Alexander's Knights Baronet settled, like from Oak Island and New Ross and Port Royal, right across the 45th parallel. And then the French were in that same exact area, and that was where the Knights of Malta went. They went to the exact same places as the Knights Baronet.
Leon, see if you support this. My understanding through Nicole's work was this area that Jim just described was sort of like the frontier. It wasn't part of the colonial empire, and that it was more towards the east where they were more, whether it was France or England, they had a imperial rule. The king was the chief and the boss, and they just sort of forgot about those others, and they just, the folks in the area that Jim described just sort of blended in, and they just lived their lives under the radar.
Right, and a lot of it was because, you know, at the time, you know, it wasn't someplace that would, it didn't want, like farther north and stuff, where places where, you know, the Vikings and like Newfoundland, different places like that, where they had places where, well, this is where we're going, or this is where we're going. So when you get down to those islands and stuff, other until they find times where the security in some of those coves were able to, you know, weather a big storm. So a lot of those, in a lot of those times when you come in, that, well, yep, we can go in, we can do this, but we have this great big huge cliff, so we can't do anything. And but there at that time, you know, you listen to stories and stuff of people that were living there, and they would just be up there just watching them. And
Well,
so
you're speaking our language too, because, you know, in the books they'll say, well, geez, must have been some big secret about Mahome Bay because nobody ever mentioned it. Well, they did mention it. They called it Burlagash.
right.
And we're going to have a show next month on it, proving that Mahone Bay, Lunenburg Bay, and St. Margaret's Bay, and potentially Halifax, that whole region was Merlegash. It was spoken to many times, and Doc actually did the math on it, and it was there for at least 125 years. But where do you read about it? The only thing you read is, oh, Merlegash used to be Lunenburg. No, it used to be that whole thing. The natives would come down from the hills in the summer to fish, go back up in the hills where it was a little bit warmer, and hunt during the winter. And they were transient in the sense that they knew where to go. They had to get the resources, wherever the resources.
One of the things about Merlegash, they did a lot of dugout canoes there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you can start seeing these posts and stuff up here. But one of the things, one of the archaeologists that I had talked to, and she's part native, and she's like, well, we have this find. And he says, she was telling us that, this guy was going out collecting logs and taking out those logs and stuff from under the water that had been there for 100 years. And then they have so much, you go pull up some of the sunken cypress and stuff, dry them, and then it makes excellent wood. Well, he was getting mad because he'd pull up these logs and they were canoes, they weren't logs. But what people don't understand, that the longevity of a log, if you trim it out and you've got it thin, it's going to crack. How did you store them? You tipped them over and you put them in the water. That's how you left them there. You look at Florida, some of the oldest.
Oh they're still in the water.
They're still in the water and stuff. You go to, I think it's Minnesota, the one lake there. They found those 12, those canoes there. But then you start seeing some of these other ones. And one of the guys, he showed us a picture and stuff. It's just, that's got a French emblem on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you start looking at some of the different carvings and stuff that they did, even from there you see a lot of the people and stuff that were around Nova Scotia also had connections to Fergus. Because you get up in those caves and stuff, and there's some of those drawings, and you will see hand-painted maps and stuff in carvings in those caves, and where the public's not allowed to go. But we've been able to get into them, take canoes in and look at them.
They have caves like that in Scotland too.
Right.
I had a friend, he's departed now, but he got special permission to go and take photographs. Just amazing stuff. Carvings of people in boats and things. They think it goes all the way back to the Picts. Well, I'm just going to take a second to read this slide here. This is Nicole Gilhous. And this kind of sums up, I don't want to speak for her, but this kind of sums up a lot of what we're talking about. And it's just one paragraph. It is important to pause here and explain what is meant by ghosts. The term ghost is meant to describe the state of individuals who are absent from state or colonial records. By the social and racial categories at work in the 17th century, these individuals have become invisible to the state. In the case of the ghosts at Lahave and Merlegash, these families sought out the Mi'kmaq community and were adopted into their kinship networks. For those along the Atlantic coast, as well as those living beyond the fort on the St. John River, they lived among native people and learned native languages and ways of life. At Lahave and Merlegash, those European-blooded families spoke Mi'kmaq, hunted and fished with Weirs, sang, danced, and ate with the Mi'kmaq.
Going right along with this, there was, at one point on this show, they found some parts of barrels.
Right.
And when I researched the Mi'kmaq in that area, they were barrel makers.
Right.
Am I got that right?
Yep. I teach coopering.
Yeah.
And I've been a cooper, and I go down to Somerset and with Mark Ware, and we do a coopering class and stuff down there. And I've done a lot of the coopering, done a lot of repair work. But when you start seeing these, and it's like it's always funny when they bring the blacksmith on. And it's kind of like, he's kind of not really wanting to get into more, but when you see a lot of these things, and you can see a style from everything with how people came. You know, you see the metal bands, you see the wooden bands, some of the first barrels that were used, that were native made. They were split spruce root wrapped around it and then let it shrink. And so when you see those, you know, then that tells you where it came from. That tells you why it is. And so, but when you look at them, you can tell, you know, by like the size of the roots, the size of the pieces that they used and the materials of where it came from.
Well, you know, this next slide here, we like to put slides up so people can slow it down and read it on their own and get more than what we talk about on the show. But there's obviously been evidence of native culture on Oak Island. And in 2021, Laird Niven discovered a native bowl. It was in the swamp area. And kind of in quick succession, a handful of other things were found, some arrowheads. I was there on the day that Jack found an arrowhead, and they were found by European artifacts, which to me speaks that perhaps there was beaver fur trading or some kind of intercourse going there, because you could literally throw a stone from the bowl over to some European artifact there. And so one of our thoughts was that maybe that was a place where they traded pelts, and it was kind of very subdued there that day. I got to go out and see the site, and let's show that clip. We'll show the clip where I filmed it. It's so short, but and so like the ghost people of this specific region, the early history of Oak Island has been buried and ignored and overwhelmed by a Eurocentric storytelling. That's why we have you here,
Right.
for the other side of the story.
And a lot of it too is, you know, it's all the what ifs. You know, I listened to one of the, we were talking the other night, me and Tyler were talking, and she says, you know, I know there's burials there, and she says, we've talked to people that there's burials in other places, and I said, well, I know there's burials there. And I said, but that's one of the things is they're not going to, and to try to, they start seeing things, and I've seen it around here at some of the dig sites, they start finding any touch, then they quit, and then you look at their dig maps and stuff, and says, well, obviously they're right here because you did not dig those blots.
Well, and speaking exactly to that, they found 2 bones in C1, which they DNA'd to Europe and Middle East.
Middle East, yeah.
And that's all you ever heard about on the show, and you never heard about them again. But guess what? They found like a half a dozen bones, and I asked Rick about, well, what was the DNA on them? You know, what's the story? And he said, there's not going to be a story. We got too much flack about a burial ground there, and we just dropped the whole thing, and we're just staying away from that area out of respect, which is understandable. That's what I would do too. It leaves the viewer kind of like, wait a minute, just last week, you know, what happened, and same way with the dump truckload of silver. You never hear about that anymore.
So if we could summarize up to this point, things that we see on TV, they have questions about, and you and the two of us and probably others see things that they find just as everyday things that would have been there, whether they were traded, it was lifestyle, it was from the Métis, it was from the Mi'kmaq, and then people that came in after them. And that's why there's such a variety of different cultures in there.
Right.
All
Okay.
piled on top of each other.
Layer on layer on layer.
You know, and it's funny because when you see some of the different archaeologists come in and they start talking about things, and they say, well, this moss is over the sand, and this and here, this, and then that's one of the things that you have to look at, is you have to look at the dioramics of that straight cut going down and read what is there. And then when you start seeing that moss and sand are put in layers, you know that that's not washed in from the ocean.
Well, one thing that's been in my craw for a while is they dated that stone platform to the 1200, something like that, because of a stick they found underneath the stone. But on the exact same report, they had a stick that dated to 1619, and they flashed it on the screen for a second, but they never mentioned it. So I went and bought the episode off the History Channel and zoomed right in there, and right under 1275 or whatever date, stick, 1619. So whether we're getting the whole story, we don't know, but there are some explainable artifacts from the indigenous point of view, and we're going to take a quick look at them on the screen here. One of them is the British lead bag seal, which of course they also attribute that immediately to the Templars, but that was known, European cloth was known, and you can confirm this or not, as one of the main trade items for beaver pelts. And that those seals were, the manufacturer, the dyer, and the distributor all had to seal it. And these are found all over in the old world near wharfs.
Right.
Because that's where they would accidentally fall out, or that's where they would tear the cloth bale apart. And I happened to find that specific design on a mill from Norwich in Norfolk County, Norfolk. So we're of the opinion that that's 17th century or 18th century, perhaps. But does that ring true about the European cloth and trade for beaver pelts?
Now, with the Canandaigua Treaty, and we talk about our wampum belts and the George Washington belt, one of the things in there that we still get and we still make them is our cloth that comes from the government, from the United States. And so that's given every year and every year. And I had seen, and I've actually got someplace, I've got one of the bale seals that's sealed. And so when you look at those, I've got Hudson Bay seals. Wow. I've got Northwest Furs Company seals. Well, done stuff that people have given me over the years. Right out in LaBeouf Creek, they found a bale seal.
Oh, really?
That's in the museum.
Well, I know they found it down in the Jamestown settlement too.
Right.
And again, they're kind of found where you might be unloading a boat or skiff or something and doing some trading. That seems to be the general place that they're found.
And when they started bringing and trading that, the fabric, the linen and stuff, then like in Pennsylvania, when William Penn was doing all the trading, they found out that deer hides lasted so much longer when they were tanned and stuff, for clothing. So that's why everybody started going, because they get fabric working in the factories and stuff, trying to do and then they just keep falling apart.
And I actually remember from when I was a kid reading about, I can envision a picture of William Penn, or at least his people, with a whole raft of European cloth over their arm as they're talking to the indigenous people. I never really put two and two together. Well, the other thing on this slide is we talked about this a little bit, but the stakes, Fred Nolan found 60 of them, and then they've found about another dozen of them. They're all about 30 inches long. A lady went up in '83 and did an article. She talked to Fred and Dan, and she got a rough measurement of them, 4 inches at the top, 2 at the bottom. The other thing that we were wondering about is, could those be for a fishing weir?
Well, they could be for fishing weirs too. One of the things that you would see, especially after European contact, especially with the Scots, is they found that, we got this log, we set this log in the water, and then, they're using, and water starts running hard or something like that, and pushing on it, and if they're just using branches, it will move them around. So one of the things that we've seen, and I've seen it here on French Creek and LaBeouf Creek, are logs that had holes in them where they would have driven stakes in.
That's exactly what they found.
And then wove into them, in which became the weir. And so when the fish were running, they would block at the other end or make a pond, and then let them come in, and then keep them from coming back.
It was like 3 episodes ago. They found a plank or a log in the ground, and one of those 30-inch pegs was hammered down into it. And I wondered at the time what that's out of order with all the other ones that they found that seemed to be just in mud. But there's your explanation right
Right,
there.
and that was more of a Scots style because you get up into New York and stuff. You get up to, by Johnson Hall and you see the Weirs and stuff. They were there. They're the exact same style.
Beautiful.
Ones in French Creek and stuff that we have found, they're the exact same style.
All right, well, let's take another gander here. Well, let's go to the lower bottom here with the bead. Now, you showed us some beadwork here earlier, and they found 4 of these so far. They're calling them Venetian beads. I don't know if they're trying to imply they were made in Venice or not, but you can find them online being made right now that look identical, you know, so beads are beads. I know they found that paddle wheeler down there in the south, somewhere around Kansas City that
Right.
had like millions of beads. Did you show us that pouch right there? What is the purpose for the rope, or what's the story?
This is actually the prisoner line. So when you were going into, you would carry your stuff like in battle. So this would be carried, but you know this is made out of dog bane. It's got quill work and stuff on it, and it was ordained because you know, if you were going to die, you wanted to cross over with your best pieces. So when you had other pieces and stuff that you carried with you, you know, I have a wampum string in here that I carry. That is, you know, where it says I'm Seneca.
And speaking of wampum, I just found this out not too long ago, but a wampum Vatican belt exists that was sent to the Pope in 1610 by Mi'kmaq, but obviously influenced by the French Catholics that were ministering to them. And one of the big things they talk about on the island all the time is this lead cross that you find there. And we did a lot of study of this, and these things were dispensed by the hundreds, if not the thousands.
Right.
And in fact, I found recently, actually thanks to Nicole's work, that there was a missionary up there, his last name was Leclerc, and he nicknamed the Mi'kmaq the cross bearers,
Right.
because they loved to wear the cross, and it wasn't just for Christian purposes, it was a shamanic thing for them too. It was part of their medicine, I guess you would
Right.
say, and so they were noted for wearing those. So the fact that that was found there's been one found over at St. John River, there's one found up in Michigan, you mentioned that earlier, at a Jesuit place there, and there were Capuchins, Jesuits, and Recollects. They're all competing. They were actually competing with each other to not who could get the most scalps, who could get the most souls, and they were just dispensing this
Right.
stuff.
In
like crazy.
in Peterborough, in one of the, I don't know if it was a museum, but we got to see a table, and I looked at it, and I'm like, they were using this table as a mold. And you could see that they had carved the cross in there, and then they would use a square cut nail, stick the nail in, and then melt bullets, and then pour them in.
Oh my gosh, we've been saying this right along.
Yeah.
But
We've been saying they reused the lead.
Right, but the thing of it was if you look at any priest, any of the Jesuits, all of them, they're not going to wear lead. They want the finest gold. They want the finest silver.
Exactly.
But what they found was, you know, now you're part of us. You know, it was that whole teaching behind, you know, like with the smallpox blankets. You know, they would come in and then they said, well, you know, we're not sick. You know, if you take this tea and you become Christ-like, you know, we'll heal you. And then they would give them to him. But, you know, like you were talking about the cross, when they first came, the French came and the Jesuits, like, well, these are going to be real easy people to convert, because they were playing a game called lacrosse. And because of the sticks that they carried were round at the top and had that cross in, just like the sticks that the churches and stuff carried.
I never thought about
So-
lacrosse.
Oh my
Right,
gosh.
and that's actually where the name comes from. Our name translates means bumping hips. But that's actually when you talk about that and you see that, that's lacrosse.
Wow.
Well, just to review things here a little bit with this last slide, it's our feeling that enough artifacts have been found on Oak Island, some that have been confirmed as from the native culture, that there's potential use of Oak Island, whether it was for a community there for a while or on and off over hundreds of years perhaps, or at least to trade with the French and the Scots. And we know that, again, they had their summer habitations down by the seashore because the fishing was so great. And so they could have come in to that, what we're calling the Mirligash area. But the cultures of the First Nations of Canada, of the Métis, whatever your feelings are about them, and of the mixed-blooded French and early Scots, many of those people would qualify as ghost people just because there's this lack of clear evidence of their history, or maybe it's better to say accepted
Right.
history. And so it has to be taken into consideration when they're talking about what the real story of Oak Island is. It did not just happen, and you mentioned how the priest would not want a lead cross. I've said this right along. There's no Templar would be caught dead wearing a lead cross. They had gold, they had silver, they had diamonds, they had emeralds. You know, why would you go and wear a lead cross? This was a utilitarian, pragmatic way for the French, particularly the French missionaries, to communicate and bring the Mi'kmaq and other groups into their fold. That's what it was about, and that's probably how that got there.
Right. And a lot of it, one of the things I was out the Four Corners region, and you talked like Micmac and Mi'kmaq. You know, you have Navajo and Dene in the same. And one of the things that they talked about there, the same is other places, that once they got their Christian cross, they always carried it right over their heart. Mm-hmm. That way, if they got into a battle, they couldn't shoot them in the heart.
Never thought of that one either.
Pragmatism, right
But
along.
when you look at those, I've done these demonstrations. You can take, you take one .62 caliber round ball, and you can make one cross. And then the shot and stuff that they came, all of that stuff. It was there, and one of the things that a lot of these guys found, even like Lewis and Clark, it's the tangible. You can, words are words, but you hand them something that they can touch.
Right.
And that goes through in traditional beliefs that we have medicine bundles that we make for drug and alcohol abuse, and that's something you can physically touch and physically hold. If they've been going through, through AA and stuff, they get a coin or they go this, but this is something that they can carry with them.
Well, I guess you'd say firm believers in everything Oak Island and Templar and all that, and then there's people that just totally debunk everything and it's just a big fraud. We're somewhere in the middle. We're saying something happened on that island. Obviously, there wouldn't be so many artifacts and stories and all that. And all we're trying to do is determine what that was. Generally, one subject or one area per show instead of delving all over the place. And that's why we wanted you here today, because you are presenting an indigenous point of view about what Oak Island could have been.
Right. And one of the things I kind of laughed about was, I said, they're all digging on the island. And I said, they're, to me, a lot more of the tangible artifacts and stuff of indigenous is going to be in those coves. Mm-hmm. It's going to be, this guy talking about he didn't want to go there anymore to scavenge any more logs because there were canoes. Well, now they're on the bottom. They can't do anything because that's Queensland.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing that I don't think we've ever mentioned, but I've been there and you've been there, and the coastline is really ragged and it's got a lot of islands and whatever, but if you wanted to get into the interior, whether it was to build an estate at New Ross or whether it was to trap beaver or interact with the indigenous people, your best bet is to go into the deepest, longest bay in, so you can get into the interior before you even have to get out of your boat. Because if you try to get off on the shorelines, most of the shoreline there is hard to maneuver, and you've got a lot of islands and everything, and then as soon as you get out, you got to walk 10 miles before you're anywhere, where you can just sail 10 miles or paddle.
You know,
10 miles
and you see
right
a
up
lot
to
of
the
it when
Golden River.
the guys talking about mariners for years that they're not going to row a boat through there. Since it gets down through there, and those waves, especially when the tide is changing, it's just going to smash them boats up in seconds against those rocks.
And they talked in older books about the backside of Oak Island before the causeway was there, that was a hiding place for ships during storms, because that's one of the closest islands to the mainland, and it's one of the bigger islands. So where are you going to go to hide out in a storm but right there? And so that's probably the reason why Oak Island appears to have gotten more foot traffic, than a lot of other places up there, because it's just the simplest, pragmatic thing to do.
Yep, you know, and you listen to some of the mariners and stuff, all the stuff they stole, then they go back, then they get knighted.
Yeah.
But if anybody was thinking, you get these people that go in there and they get in those, they take their ships in there. And there's only one way in and one way out. So pirates can come in, they see them go in there, they're going to wait for them and then cut it off. And so they got their own human fish weir.
Yeah, and particularly with Mahome Bay, there's only one channel that's deep enough for any major ship to get in. It's a direct line, basically, from the bay or the ocean into about where Chester is. And Oak Island's just off to the left of Chester as you're going in. And that's where they have a yacht club at the end there. And that's, they all, just exactly
That's
like
perfect.
you say, they don't like, oh, I'm going over to this end and that end, because they know they're going to hit shoals and stuff. They go right down that line back and forth. So it's exactly what you're talking about.
You know, we're getting close to the end,
Yeah, we
but
better
I have a
close up.
question, and I want and you can answer any way you like. Oral tradition, Mi'kmaq tradition, treasure. Did anybody deposit anything there from oral tradition?
Oral tradition, a lot of they talk about caches, they talk about store, but a lot of it is, you know, like the canoes, a lot of the stuff, you know, our wampum belts, those Quahog shells. You know, that's what these are made out of. That's made out of them stems. And so those places where they can gather those, you know, and to them, you know, that other indigenous people, those were fine trade items.
Excellent.
Well, and I'd like to real quick ask about the sketchman or etchman, because apparently the Mi'kmaq, their nickname for them was the canoe men.
Right.
And I looked up stetch, and it was an old word that was kind of a cross between a stash and a cache.
Right.
And so if you just take that etymology, is that the word? You're talking about people who are taking the cache of goods in a canoe somewhere for somebody. Do you know if that was a legitimate separate tribe, or was that a referral to a certain
I think a lot of it
occupation?
was a referral, but when we talk about the logs and them being hewed for the storage and stuff, a lot of times what they would do is they would have, you know, tangible things that they use all the time, and they would wrap them, put them in the canoe, and then sink the canoe. So when they would turn it over, you know, it was being protected, so they come back and they didn't have to carry it.
Well, I'll tell you, we've learned so much here today.
Awesome.
We can't thank you enough for coming by. You're our first in-studio guest, and I think we're probably going to have more if they can fill your moccasins.
Okay. Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed today's episode of Oak Island Plus with our very, very special guest, Leon Sam Briggs, the man. Boy, you filled in so much, and we thank you. And I think we tied in a lot of loose pieces that we've been talking about. Eh?
Yes. For
Okay.
Sure. We'll give them a good Seneca goodbye.
Like a lot of times when we would leave, we would simply walk out there and say Ona, or we would say Eshkongeai. And that's keeping us safe until the next time we meet.
Okay, and there you have it.
How do you pronounce it?
Eshkongeai.
All right, on three. 1, 2, 3.
Eshkongeai.
This is Robert Clotworthy, and you have been listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Be sure to catch every episode.